We'd like to thank all of the sponsors for our upcoming conference, and I think we are ready to get started with the webinar.
Okay, well, welcome everybody to today's program. My name is John Haber. I'm the Field Services Director for the California Preservation Foundation. There's a few things we wanted to go over briefly before everybody started here. First of all, I wanted to thank our donors for today's program. We had donations for today's program, including donations from Anna, Anthony, Antonio, Cinia, Claudia, James, Maida, Ning, John, and Pamela. And so those donations help support our program. So we really appreciate your support. If you haven't donated, you can still do that. You just go to californiapreservation.org/donate. And I don't know if Chris was going to go over a few other things or if she'd like me to do that right now.
First, we're going to have Cindy introduce the program.
Okay, I thought we were going, okay, I'll turn it right over to Cindy then.
All right, thanks, John. I want to thank everyone for joining. We have a big crowd today, and so we're going to be managing this in the meeting format. Want to welcome you all to The Doctor Is In. I want to start by thanking our speaker today, Deborah Rosenthal, and also by thanking our education sponsor, Wish Jenny Elsner. This is, as I mentioned, the new program format for us. We're doing this in the meeting format, although The Doctor Is In is not a new program for us. It's your opportunity to ask questions of our experts. And so what we're doing is focusing on a specific topic. We'll kick it off. These are all topics that relate to historic preservation issues in California. We'll be holding more sessions like this as we go throughout the year. We'll be holding them on a regular basis. So we're looking for recommendations from all of our attendees on topics and speakers that you would like to see in this format. So this is where you come in. During the program, you're going to see some prompts requesting your ideas and recommendations for topics and speakers. This is to help us plan future programs, not just The Doctor Is In, but we want to see where the interest lies so that we can produce other programs, either our free webinars or our seminars for our members and for our free programs. So do take your time to write your recommendations in when you're prompted. The Doctor Is In is a benefit of membership. And if you're not a member of CPF, we would encourage you to join. We're offering a 10% discount today and tomorrow using the discount code SAVE10. This code will be in the chat and will be shown during the program. Membership starts at $50 and $250 for companies with generous benefits, including free and reduced price attendance at all of our educational programs, conference, design awards, and it supports our work in Sacramento. During the past 2 years, we've seen over 40,000 people attend our program. So we have a great audience. We're thrilled that you're with us here today. We want to offer the current and best practices in historic preservation. So please consider joining and donating. I'm going to turn the mic over to John and Chris for information on how to participate in today's program.
Thank you. I'm not sure how somebody unmuted themselves, but I just wanted to remind people, please don't unmute yourself until we have a Q&A portion of this program. You should be automatically muted when you enter the room. Just wanted to thank everybody for joining us today. I wanted to remind you all that in the chat box, I pasted a few links. The one that we'll be using today is, let me move some things out of the way. Looks like this. You'll be going to pigeonhole.at/CEQA. And there are 2 questions we want to know from you today. First of all is what future programs you would like to see from CPF. That'll give us an idea of what you'd like to see in future Doctor Is In sessions. And the second, of course, relates to today's program. What question do you have for Deborah? And within that question, once you complete entering that, you can thumbs up or vote up a question that you see in the list. You can also make a comment on any questions, and the 3 of us will be fielding those questions to Deborah once we filter through them. We have a lot of people today, so we're trying to get through as many questions as we possibly can in the time we have. So we want you to try to be succinct and don't ask redundant questions, if you may, please. And in the meantime, I'm going to turn it back over to Chris if she has any final words, and then we're going to start the program.
Sure, John, you know I always have something else to say. So if you have any other comments, you are also encouraged to use the chat window like we usually do on our programs. And I wanted to encourage everybody to go to californiapreservation.org for more information about our upcoming programs. We have 2 free programs coming up in the next couple of Tuesdays. And also, of course, please join and donate often and as much as you want. Okay, I think we're ready to get started. If you have any questions, you can also communicate with John and I in the chat window. Back to you, Cindy.
Thank you, Chris and John. So our speaker today is Deborah Rosenthal. Deborah is an AICP, specializes in real estate, land use, and natural resources and environmental law at Fitzgerald, Creditor, Bolduc, Risbro, LLP in Irvine. That's a mouthful. Deborah devotes her practice to land use and environmental law and litigation. She works extensively with land use and environmental issues in California, including wetlands, endangered species, takings, historic preservation, mitigation banking, and coastal issues. Deborah has also been involved in a variety of complex federal and state coordinated environmental permitting programs for large private developments, including the negotiation of development agreements and preparation of development plans. Deborah serves on our advocacy committee and is a former CPF trustee. So Deborah, we're going to kick it off by talking about projects. So one of the fundamental underpinnings of the California Environmental Quality Act is determining what is a project. CEQA is triggered when a public agency determines that a proposed activity is a project. So could you step in and define what is a project?
I would be delighted to do that, but first I'd like to say that I'm honored to have been asked to kick off this this new iteration of the Dr. is in, and to know that so many people are interested in these topics. I think it's a sign of the great job that CPF has been doing for more than 40 years, and the growing interest in preservation as Californians recognize that if we don't save it, it won't be here for future generations. I also need, because I am a lawyer as well as a preservation planner, to point out that anything I say today is my personal opinion. It is not the position of my firm, which is a bit of a mouthful. It doesn't establish an attorney-client relationship, and it's legal information, not legal advice. With that said, I will like to start talking about the kind of legal issues, and because preservation occurs in the political space as well, they frequently become political issues. Cindy is right that the fundamental question is, what is a project? Because CEQA only applies to projects. And it's really a multi-part definition. And it is the place where a lot of preservation projects and preservation organizations get tripped up. First of all, it's any sort of action that changes or has the potential for changing the physical environment that involves governmental approval, so a permit, governmental funding, or governmental organization, governmental construction. A lot of times I think we've all seen local governments who somehow believe themselves to be exempt from having to comply with historic preservation requirements. Government construction is covered as well. But simply being a governmental approval isn't the only part of the question. The next issue is whether it's a ministerial decision or a discretionary decision. And this will frequently depend on local regulations. For instance, In some communities, a demolition permit for a building over 50 years old will have to get discretionary approval. In other communities, no demolition permits are discretionary as long as you meet the requirements for hauling the debris away, you get a demolition permit. So even if it's a permit, if the public agency can't say no, then it's not a project under CEQA. And then the final issue, which is frequently helpful in preservation, is sometimes there'll be multi-part decisions. And the first part of the decision may not affect a preservation issue, but once a public agency has committed itself to a course of conduct, so it's inevitable that a historic structure may be eliminated, that if it's discretionary, that triggers CEQA review and historic preservation review. And a lot of times public agencies will say, well, it's just the first step. But if that first step makes a commitment, makes a decision, for instance, if they approve something that cannot proceed without demolishing an historic resource, that can be reviewed as a project under CEQA. So I hope that isn't confusing, but part of what it means is you have to keep your eye on, as a community activist, you have to keep your eye on what's going on at the city, and you have to understand what the local rules are for when something is discretionary, and if possible, lobby to have local ordinances that make these kinds of decisions discretionary. So Cindy, does that lay a somewhat complicated framework? Cindy, I can't, you're muted.
Oh, thank you, Deborah. Maybe I'll turn it over. I see that Cindy's still muted.
I'm trying. There we go. Sorry, John. I was locked out. I couldn't unmute. So
okay.
Anyway, Deborah, right? It is a kind of setting the framework for a very, or I think is a kind of a nuanced conversation. What we see oftentimes are people calling because, as I say, a building is going to be demolished. They're going not going to do anything, going to put in a parking lot. But the real intention is to really clear the way for future development. And sometimes it's stated, sometimes it's not. So I think that your advice to be diligent and to have people watching is good advice, and to understand and to ask questions about what's happening.
And one of the things I'd say that, and it may be thanks to some of CPF's educational programs, is that when I moved to California 35 years ago, I would say a large number of the preservation calls I got were from community groups who said they've just issued a demolition permit for a building that we know is historic. What do we do? And the answer was frequently, there isn't anything you can do. Sometimes there was, but I'm not getting as many of those calls anymore, because I think community advocates are beginning to understand that that there has to be planning for how to protect historic resources.
Right. So why does it matter if work meets the definition of a project?
Well, because that's how CEQA gets triggered. That's the simple answer. You could have a building that was of international significance and on the National Register, and but not locally designated, not protected in by demolition review requirements, and it could be demolished. I know there have been situations with green and greenhouses where interiors, in particular, design features have been removed without notice. And there's really, under the current legal system, very little that can be done if the local agency doesn't have an ordinance in place. And we can talk a little bit more about surveys and the importance not only of having a local ordinance, but of pre-identifying historic resources before there's an emergency, both to avoid the scramble, to avoid the loss and disappointment when the local regulation fails, and also to give, well, I'd have to say is fair notice to a lot of property owners. And that's coming up. I mean, you sort of have to say that if there's a developer who buys an 1890 Queen Anne, that there's a pretty good chance they're going to, at least the idea that it would be historic is going to pass their mind. But for post-war buildings, we're still working on having the idea that those are both they're historic and can be architectural treasures, and it doesn't cross someone's mind.
Right. I know that one of the arguments that we make for conducting surveys is really to do that pre-noticing, but also really to help streamline projects so that people know, both the local government, the applicant, that something has historic significance. So kind of taking off on that, what is a historical resource under CEQA?
Well, that is a topic of some dispute, but the legislature, the legislative definition, and I think the better position is that it is a building that is either listed on this California Register or eligible for the California Register. If it's on the National Register or eligible for the National Register, it is automatically going to be on the California Register. If it is in some way locally designated and on a local historic register, and the local government has an ordinance in place that restricts things that could be done. Some communities, and I think they're, I would say, a little unclear on the concept, have been known to designate historic buildings and then not provide for any protections. So that is kind of a failure of imagination. And then buildings that meet the statutory definition, you don't have to have any formal designation, but if there is evidence that it meets the criteria for listing, which are things like the work of a master, or important in a movement, an historical movement associated with an important person, associated with important engineering developments. I worked on a project once that raised many interesting questions because it had a relatively unique internal trussing system, which was potentially important, but it wasn't visible because it was behind the walls and the ceilings. So does that make it eligible, not eligible? Is it something that you make drawings of? But So those become areas of concern. And one of the reasons that I speak so highly and strongly about the importance of surveys is that surveys, when you can do a survey, you know ahead of time, and you've pre-identified buildings that are likely to meet that statutory definition. And that then gives a community a chance to make the decision, not in a big middle of a big fight, but ahead of time. It allows to have the idea of districts identified. Districts sort of followed a little later after individual landmarks. And so the idea that you have a survey that tells you when you have a cohesive suite of important buildings can be extremely important. There are some legal issues right now that I hope the legislature will be willing to look at soon. We have a California inventory that includes buildings that have been identified on qualifying surveys and sort of establishes a presumption that they're historic, that because the legislature is so anxious to make sure that they're only protecting designated buildings in some way, getting on a California qualifying survey can make the difference between having it be subject to CEQA or having it be ministerial. And there's a very strange provision that says that surveys should be updated after 5 years citywide, which is not really practical. And as I've said, when we try to talk about this, that it usually historic buildings don't become less historic by becoming older. Usually they're more historic unless they've been subjected to neglect, benign or otherwise. So I think that is that's an important way to look at the range of buildings. The last way to do it is, and it's probably the one that causes the most heartburn for developers and for local government officials, is to wait until an application for a project comes in, and at that point ask the developer to go and or landowner to go and prepare their own survey, frequently at substantial cost. And frankly, developers suspect that every historic preservation advocate or consultant wants to prevent all 100% of change. And the preservation communities suspect that anyone who is being paid by the developer is trying to tear down buildings. So so that's the that is the way most public agencies have done it for many years, and I think it's one of the worst ways to do it. And anyone who's interested, CPF, I know, would love to have some of any surplus funds that California has be devoted to doing surveys. But the difference that Survey LA has made in their ability to process applications and to give advance notice. Thanks primarily to city support and the Getty, has been phenomenal. And it could go, it doesn't have to be as big as LA. Any size community has the right to have a survey that identifies its history.
Yeah. So we're getting some questions in, and I have one that actually relates to the next point we'll be talking about, is about owner consent. This came in through the chat, and it was, how can CEQA be used or strengthened to prevent demolition by neglect? And that was a question from Dennis.
Okay, well, that's a good question, Dennis. And there are quite a few building owners who say, well, if they're going to designate my building, they'll just let people watch them fall down. The fact is that that local governments are allowed to adopt regulations that require buildings to be maintained in good repair. And there are two parts to that. One is that every building, and essentially every jurisdiction in the state, subject to under state law, has the right to prevent nuisances. And they have the right to go in and force an owner to do repairs themselves, or if the owner either won't or can't afford it, to do the repairs, to have the local government do the repairs, and to have them be able to recover the funds from either the owner or the property. Many cities have requirements that that historic buildings be maintained in good condition, by which they include historic condition. And unless there's some sort of emergency situation, they can both require that work be done and that work meet historic, at least minimal historic standards.
Mm-hmm. So Deborah, I don't know if you can see the questions that were posted from Pigeonhole. We have some up there. You might want to take some of these and answer them.
Sure. Do you want to pick one, or
Let's
start from the left and go right, vice versa?
Whatever you want. I think if you pick something that's related to the topic, because we still have some other territory to cover, but perhaps the demolition of a historic building, the second one, can it ever be mitigated to lessen significant via mitigation measures?
Well, I know that that the famous quote from the old Montgomery Ward case in Oakland was that that doing Habs drawings were like drawing a line around the body on the floor after you've torn down the building. It is quite unusual for demolition of an historic building to be mitigated to less than significant via mitigation measures. And it's almost always objected to by the local preservation community. I worked on a project recently where we're moving an historical building rather than demolishing it was considered full mitigation over the objections of the local community, and probably inconsistently with federal recommendations on relocating buildings. I personally think there are some very, and this is again a personal opinion, some very unusual cases that relate to what makes the building significant. So for instance, when I mentioned the unusual trussing system that was that couldn't be seen, it is possible that if the idea was to keep that trussing available for research, that scale drawings would actually serve the same educational purpose. It is maybe possible that that buildings, especially if they've had some changes that are associated with individuals, might be able to be demolished, although that would be extremely unusual. And then you have the somewhat bizarre situation that I think we saw with the old Huntington, the beautiful hotel up in Pasadena, where it was torn down and then reconstructed, which does not meet National Register Secretary standards, but for California purposes, it would at least be possible as a question. So the answer is 99% of the time, no, you can't mitigate below a level of significance. But I think it is always worth looking at what it is that makes the building important and try to make sure that what you're doing is protecting that, that public benefit. Okay. Okay, cumulative impacts in an EIR. That is actually, it's an interesting question, and it does have to do with what the particular impacts are. It's one of the reasons that it can be extremely helpful to have a district designation, so that if somebody comes in, you can actually already have an impact area identified to look at whether you're going to have impacts not just to the individual building, but to the entire area. For thematic designations, not geographic, it can also be very interesting that sort of what death by 1,000 cuts or nibbled to death by ducks. You go in and you're not making really big changes to a particular building, but if every building of that type were to be given the same treatment, pretty soon you wouldn't have a district. And that's one of the things that is going on in Laguna Beach, in a case that CPF is participating in, where Laguna Beach is known for its cottage architecture, and that the individual buildings are not architecturally fabulous. But there's a lot of them, and they form a coherent whole. And if the city starts allowing the windows to be changed, the entrances to be changed, 2 stories instead of 1 story, pretty soon the whole historic tenor and flavor of the community is gone. So what an EIR should do is, for each impact area, it should look at this building or this resource and how it's going to when added up with other projects, how that's going to affect the historic character of a community. And you can certainly see how that has worked to the benefit of a community in the city of Orange, where they have, I think, the largest residential National Register historic district. And it's just craftsman after craftsman after craftsman. And you can practically see women in 1920s dresses walking down the street in your imagination, because it's because they've kept a handle on cumulative impacts.
Right. So we have a situation, and one of the questions there's a question about kind of brings up the obligation, the responsibility of public agencies to investigate historic resources when they're taking on a project. And the question that's in the box up here relates to the Capital Annex project. So one of the, you can see that there, everyone can see that. I don't know if you can address this. I don't know how familiar you are with the project that's proposed.
All right, I am not familiar in detail with the Capital Annex project, but I can comment on what the question asks, and listeners will have to decide if it applies to this situation or not. First of all, the legislature can, on occasion, exempt itself from having to comply with almost anything unless it was adopted by initiative. I don't know whether the legislature did something to try and exempt itself, but state agencies are definitely subject to following CEQA. They generally get to exempt themselves from the local government review. There are some special rules for state-owned historic buildings where they are actually supposed to receive a higher level of protection by state law than, say, county-owned buildings. And there is supposed to be a project, especially when the state is attempting to sell or convey historic buildings. And pre-commitment to demolition doesn't mean CEQA is null. It actually means CEQA is violated. So yes, it is quite possible that a public agency will say too late. And there would have to be an analysis of what the time to sue was, when the decision was made. But the whole idea, and there have been a number of cases on this question of pre-commitment that says if you agree to do something that requires demolition, you violated CEQA and you have to go back and start over. But it's it's sort of like the legislature exempting itself from insurance requirements or pay requirements. They have, in some cases, some unusual rules.
Yeah, for anyone in our audience who's not familiar with this, this is a pretty hot issue. There are currently 4 lawsuits pending on this. It is the East Annex of the Capitol is slated for demolition. It's listed on the National Register, and the Capitol Park, which is a state park, is also threatened with tree loss, and many of these are irreplaceable. So it's a current issue, and there's some information that can be found on this on
the Save Our Capital, and the there's another website, the PAC Annex group has a lot of information for those who want to follow up.
This is, I just comment, this is something that is coming up more and more, and I won't say it's a new issue, but it's an issue that catches a lot of local governments to be surprised, is the idea of cultural or landscape, designated landscapes. There's no question that on the National Register, landscape districts can be designated, or landscapes associated with a great developer. In the city of Newport Beach, there have recently been discussions of proposals to cut down an historic rows, I believe, of palm trees on the theory that they were that they were diseased, which is usually how agencies back into this question without considering whether they've got an historic landscape on their hands. So I just recommend that that local community groups try to make sure that the public agencies understand that landscapes themselves can be part of the historic character and designated.
Sure. Do you want to take this next question that's on the screen?
This is one of those things that I know people hate when lawyers say, well, it depends, or we need to find it out. If something is on a local register and the register is either formally adopted or meets the formal survey standards, it should be submitted. The question is, I would say yes, a state agency should submit it to the registries. The unresolved question is whether a community group or an individual can take that submittal and take it to, it depends whether it would go on the state inventory. It can certainly be submitted for California Register listing, but I have to say, aside from the legal issues, which I'm happy to discuss about owner consent, the SHPO can be quite nervous about getting nominations, the equivalent of nominations from a third party, especially if it's based on a survey. They like to see surveys submitted by the public agencies, even though I don't see anything in the law that requires that.
Right. So did we have some other questions coming in? And there you go. I'll take the next question. It's going to depend on the building. If a project would result in a significant unavoidable impact, can you talk a bit about range of project alternatives? Project alternatives is an area where there's a lot of what I would call funny business, that it is a favorite trick and always has been of public agencies to select impossible alternatives and then say, see, there was nothing we could do. But let's assume that there's a public agency that is more open to a realistic assessment.
some of the question is going to be, again, what is important about the building? And what is it that because one of the things a lot of cities don't do is that you're only supposed to discuss alternatives that avoid significant adverse impact. Way too many EIRs will just pick alternatives out of the air, and they won't be related to unavoidable impacts. So the first thing is that if the impact is on historic resources, the alternatives must lessen those impacts, and while still achieving a reasonable percentage of the project goal. And the other rule is that an alternative or a mitigation measure does not have to completely avoid the impact. It can lessen the impact. And for preservationists, these can be bitter pills to swallow, but in a number of instances, a retention of a facade, even if it doesn't completely avoid the significant adverse impacts, will be considered to substantially reduce the range of the impact enough that if it's feasible, it has to be adopted. So it's a question of in many cases, it is a half a loaf or a quarter loaf. Buildings that are proposed for upgrades because of either functional obsolescence or ADA compliance can be proposed for demolition, sometimes on the argument that that's less expensive than some form of preservation. And but using the historic building code and allowing removable, even if unattractive or non-historic changes, can actually be an alternative which would meet the requirements of, clearly meet the requirements of a project alternative that should be considered and quite likely should be adopted under CEQA.
Yeah. So I want to step back a moment, Deborah. We talked just briefly about owner consent. So how does owner consent affect historic resources under CEQA?
Well, that is, first of all, it in a number of communities, a building cannot be locally listed over an owner's objection. So if you're relying on a local listing in order to be considered an historic resource under CEQA, owner consent can prevent that from happening. The other piece of it is that both the National Register and the California Register have owner's consent requirements for historical reasons going back to the 1970s and 80s. But both of them have developed a system where a building can be declared eligible even without an owner's consent and can nonetheless be treated as historic. But one of the big issues is at the local government level, if you are, if you have a discretionary review process, so it becomes discretionary instead of ministerial for historic buildings, but you can't get an historic building designated without owner consent, then the owner is in control of whether the building is going to be considered historic and or treated as discretionary. And to me, it's a very bizarre situation to, you're effectively asking an owner, would you like to have your building subject to regulation? And there are almost no owners who will say, yes, please regulate me. Even if what they want to do is the right thing, they always say, we'll take care of it ourselves. So I actually think owner consent is in no way, shape, or form legally necessary, and under certain circumstances may be legally objectionable.
Interesting.
Okay.
Question.
Housing.
It seems to be something that we're wrestling with at CPF, and I think people around the state are. And it's currently, for those who might not be too know much about what CPF has done, is we've been monitoring a lot of the housing bills, and we were effective in getting amendments to SB 9 to protect historic resources or exempt them. But it has been a constant, I won't call it a battle, but we have to be vigilant, because these regulations that are coming forward that keep chipping away at CEQA and historic resources in the name of streamlined housing just seem to be endless. Deborah, you want to kind of take this?
Yes, I do. And I think CEQA is in danger of being watered down and eliminated in the name of additional housing. And CPF has been relatively successful in about half the new statutes of not avoiding the push for more housing, but of avoiding the streamlining. So the idea is that if a housing proposal is going to have an impact on designated historic resources, they have to go through a complete review process rather than being exempt from the review process. That is something that I think the preservation community really needs to do some hard thinking about, because when we speak to legislators, there is a deep suspicion that that preservationists are really, as the first question says, been used as a tool of NIMBYism and elitism, and in a way of maintaining economic segregation in older communities. And there have been two results from that. One of them, and it's something that CPF has really been struggling with, is that the legislature only wants buildings that have been designated, are on a local register or state California register or national register, to be excluded without really giving an opportunity for most cities to look at whether the buildings are historic or not, or the structures. And we've been unable to convince the legislators that in California, most historic buildings haven't been designated in advance of a project being proposed because it's just too expensive. And nobody wants to have a political fight or pay for a survey until the bulldozer is about to hit the road. So so we've been trying to figure out ways, and surveys are one of them, to broaden the scope of pre-identified buildings. And that is in large measure because the legislature is really, really suspicious. They want to protect what they consider to be real historic resources. They really do. I don't think we've talked to a single legislator who said, forget it, we don't care. They all say we care, but we don't want to delay housing. And I think in a lot of ways, that's on us as preservationists. There is a new law that that I am concerned about. I don't think it's been, it's a brand new amendment to the Housing Crisis Act of 2019. And what it says is, I think most people who work in this sphere know that that a project in California gets deemed complete when you submitted all of the information that is on a pre-identified list. And once that's done and it's deemed complete, the city usually can't come in and start changing the requirements for the building afterwards. So deemed complete is a big moment. Lots of champagne corks popping with developers when you're deemed complete. And the new amendments, it's section 65913.10, requires the city to determine whether the site of a proposed housing development project is an historic site at the time the application is deemed complete. And that can be anything from a giant multi-use project to a single family house. They want the city to decide whether it is an historic site basically before the project even gets started. And that is a complete turnaround of the way it's usually been done. We talked about the fact that it in most cases, unless you can have a survey done, the historic review happens at the time the project is being reviewed, frequently through CEQA. Now, in speaking with the legislator, she agreed that that CEQA would still apply. This was not an attempt to avoid having to go through CEQA. It was an attempt to streamline the project by having the decisions made that were going to affect the project earlier rather than later. We never actually figured out how that would work. It is possible that a local agency, if they're willing to, could request some sort of historic analysis as part of the deemed complete process. But it's the legislation also tightens up on that process. So it's so we don't know right now how our usual process of using CEQA at the end of the project is going, after you know all the impacts, is going to work with the requirement that if it's historic, that's supposed to be decided at the very beginning of the project. These are sort of the the things that make it challenging, and in some ways with the best intentions in the world, apply the doctrine of unintended consequences to new legislation.
Yeah. Well, we're right on time. This is when our program ends. And Deborah, I want to thank you. We've got still a lot of questions that haven't been answered. We're going to collect these and see if we can do something with them. But I want to remind people to please give us a list using Pigeonhole of programs that you would like to see in the future. We need this information to help plan for the future as we move this program forward. And Deborah, I want to thank you so much for taking your time to be here with us and for all the work that you've done and we continue to do to help us in the legislative arena. We're deeply indebted to you. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today. Don't forget, please, as I said, give us your recommendations for sessions, but also please consider joining CPF. Membership supports all of our work and everything that we do, and members are really the backbone of this organization. I want to thank John and Chris, and again, our education sponsor was Jenny Elsner, and all of our annual sponsors. Don't forget to register for the conference. It's going to be fantastic.